Welcome back to another bedtime story. I hope you've had a peaceful day, and if not, I pray this time brings you rest. Settle in, find a comfortable place, and take a deep breath in and out. Let the weight of the day slip away as we unwind together. Tonight, let's reflect on trust. Trust in the unseen, trust in provision, even in the hardest times. Our story takes us to a time of famine, where a poor widow gathers the last of her food, believing it will be her final meal. But when a stranger arrives asking for bread, she must decide, can she trust in something greater? This is the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, a tale of faith, sacrifice, and a miracle that defies all reason. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let the story unfold. The land was dry, cracked under the weight of a relentless drought. The sky, once generous with rain, had turned distant and silent. Across Israel, hunger gripped the people. Wells had run dry, fields lay barren, and even the animals wandered weakly in search of food. But amidst this suffering, a prophet walked with quiet purpose. His name was Elijah. One day, as he sat in the shade of a dying tree, the Lord spoke to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food." It was an unexpected command. Zarephath was a foreign land outside Israel's borders, ruled by those who worshipped other gods. And a widow? She would be one of the poorest in society, barely able to sustain herself, let alone a stranger. Yet Elijah did not question. He had seen God's provision before, and he trusted that where God sent him, God would provide. So he set out on foot, journeying across the barren land. Days passed under the scorching sun, his throat dry, his body aching with hunger. But finally, as he neared the gates of Zarephath, he saw her, a frail woman bent over, gathering sticks. Her movements were slow, tired, her clothes worn thin. Elijah stepped forward and called out to her, "Please, bring me a little water in a jar so I may drink." Even in times of famine, hospitality was a sacred duty. Though water was scarce, she nodded and turned to fetch it. But before she could take a step, Elijah called again, "And please bring me a piece of bread." At this, the widow froze. Slowly, she turned back to him, sorrow filling her weary eyes. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, "I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering these sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her voice trembled, not just with sorrow, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had long stopped hoping. Yet Elijah remained firm, his voice steady. "Do not be afraid," he told her gently. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow stared at him. Could it be true? Could she really give away the last of what she had? If he was wrong, she and her son would starve even sooner. But something about Elijah's words stirred her heart. A whisper of trust, a flicker of faith. With shaking hands, she turned and walked toward her home. The widow's home was small, a single-room dwelling with cracked walls and a dirt floor. A simple table stood in the corner, its surface dusted with flour from past meals, though there had been fewer and fewer of those lately. She set down the bundle of sticks and moved toward the shelf where her jar of flour and jug of oil sat. Her fingers hesitated on the jar's rim. It was nearly empty, just a handful left. Her son lay curled on a mat in the corner, too weak from hunger to play, his breaths slow and shallow. She could feel the sharpness of his ribs when she touched him, and yet Elijah's words echoed in her mind. Do not be afraid. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry. Was this man truly sent by God? Could she trust him? Her heart pounded as she reached into the jar. She scooped out the last handful of flour and let it spill into a small bowl. Then, tipping the jug, she watched the last trickle of oil pool into the mix. With careful hands, she kneaded the dough, shaping it into a small, fragile loaf, their final meal. But instead of placing it before her son, she turned and handed it to Elijah. The prophet took it with quiet gratitude and ate. She watched him, feeling both fear and wonder at what she had just done. She had given away her last bit of sustenance, not to her starving child, but to a stranger. The weight of her choice settled over her. She turned back to the shelf, knowing what she would find: an empty jar, a dry jug. But when she looked, her breath caught in her throat. The jar was not empty. The flour, which should have been gone, was still there, and the jug, where there had been just a last trickle of oil, felt heavy in her hands. She gasped, lifting it quickly. Tilting the jug, she watched in disbelief as golden oil flowed freely once more. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears. It was true. The prophet had spoken truth. From that day on, no matter how many times she scooped from the jar or poured from the jug, the supply never ran out. Flour and oil, enough for each day, just as Elijah had promised. The widow's faith had been tested, and through her trust, she had witnessed a miracle. Elijah remained in her home, and each day the three of them ate together, proof of God's provision in a time of despair. The morning after the widow prepared Elijah's first meal, she woke early, expecting to find the flour jar empty, the oil jug dry. But as she stepped into the dim light of dawn and ran her fingers over the clay rim of the flour jar, a shiver ran down her spine. There was still flour inside, not much, but enough. With trembling hands, she lifted the small jug of oil. Tilting it carefully, she watched as golden drops slid effortlessly into the bowl. How? She stared in stunned silence. The night before, she had scraped the last remnants of flour together, had poured every last drop of oil. She was sure of it, yet here it was again. Doubt gnawed at her, whispering that perhaps she had miscalculated. Perhaps the jar had not been as empty as she thought. But the next morning, the same thing happened, and the next, and the next. Each day the miracle unfolded before her eyes. Every time she reached for the jar, there was just enough. Every time she tipped the jug, the oil flowed. Not in abundance, not overflowing, but always sufficient. At first, she hesitated. She measured the portions carefully, afraid to use too much. What if it suddenly stopped? What if one morning she woke to find the jar finally barren? But the fear that had ruled her heart for so long, fear of hunger, fear of loss, fear of watching her son waste away, began to loosen its grip. She baked bread for Elijah, for her son, for herself. And soon her son's cheeks grew fuller, his frail body no longer weak with hunger. The lifeless dullness in his eyes faded, replaced with the bright curiosity of a child once more. For the first time in what felt like years, she heard him laugh. The house, once filled with silence and worry, now carried the warmth of life again. Elijah remained with them, teaching her about the God of Israel, the one who had sent him to her doorstep. She listened intently as he spoke of his wonders, of how he had parted the Red Sea, how he had sent manna from heaven to feed his people in the wilderness. And now he had provided for her. She, a foreigner, a woman outside of Israel, outside of his covenant, and yet he had seen her. He had not overlooked her suffering. One evening, as she set fresh bread before them, she glanced at Elijah, eyes filled with wonder. "Your God, he has not forgotten me?" Elijah smiled, nodding. "He is a God of life, of provision, and of promise. He sees you, even in the midst of famine." Days stretched into weeks, and still the flour and oil never ran out. What had once been a daily struggle for survival became a quiet confidence. Each day God would provide. Hope returned. The widow, once filled with doubt, now walked with renewed faith. She thought the worst had passed, but just when she began to believe that things would truly be all right, a shadow fell over her home once more. Her son, the child she had fought so desperately to keep alive, suddenly grew ill, and this time no amount of flour or oil could save him. For the first time in months, life had begun to feel steady again. The widow no longer woke each morning with a pit in her stomach, dreading how she would feed her son. The flour and oil, though never in excess, had remained constant. Each morning she would knead the dough, feeling its softness between her fingers, marveling at how, day after day, her supplies were sustained. Her son, once weak and listless, now had energy. He laughed, he played, he listened as Elijah told stories of his God, the one who had made this all possible. But peace is a fragile thing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the scent of fresh bread filled their small home, her son coughed. A small thing at first, just a dry clearing of the throat. The widow barely noticed. By morning the cough had deepened, his breath labored and uneven. She hovered beside him, wiping his forehead, whispering soothing words as he curled against her. His skin, once warmed with life, was now hot with fever. His little hands trembled in hers, his once bright eyes heavy with exhaustion. Fear gripped her heart. She had seen this before, the sickness that crept in like a thief, stealing away the weak. She had seen neighbors lose their children, had watched mothers clutch lifeless bodies in grief. Number, not him. She pressed a damp cloth to his burning skin, willing him to open his eyes, to look at her the way he always did, with trust, with love, but he did not stir. "Elijah!" she cried, voice shaking. The prophet rushed to her side, his expression darkening as he took in the boy's condition. "Do something," she pleaded. Your God, he brought us flour. He kept us alive. Why is this happening?" Elijah knelt beside the child, resting a hand over his chest, feeling the weak rise and fall of his breathing. The widow's voice rose, thick with grief. "What have I done? Did I sin against your God? Is he punishing me by taking my son?" Her words were sharp, filled with anguish, but beneath them lay something deeper, betrayal. She had dared to believe. For months she had let herself trust that they were safe, that perhaps for once she did not have to live in fear. And yet, just when hope had finally taken root in her heart, it was being ripped away. Elijah did not answer immediately. Instead, he gently gathered the frail boy into his arms, lifting him as though he weighed nothing at all. "I will take him," he said quietly. "I will plead to the Lord on his behalf." The widow hesitated, her hands trembling as she released her son. She had no choice. As Elijah carried the lifeless boy to the upper room, she sank to her knees, and for the first time she wept. Elijah carried the child's limp body up the narrow wooden staircase, his heart pounding with urgency. The boy's small frame felt weightless in his arms, but the burden upon his spirit was immeasurable. He laid the child upon his own bed, stepping back for a moment, staring at the stillness before him. The room, once a place of solitude and prayer, now felt heavy with sorrow. Elijah turned his gaze upward. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with desperation. "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even upon this widow who has opened her home to me? Must her son die as well?" The silence that followed was deafening. This was the woman who had trusted God, who had given her last morsel of food to a stranger in faith. And now, after all that she had endured, she was being forced to suffer again? Elijah would not accept this. He took a deep breath, then stretched himself over the child, his body pressing against the boy's still form. 3 times he lowered himself, arms spread as if shielding him, as if willing his own life into the lifeless body beneath him. And 3 times he cried out, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." A moment passed, then another, then the faintest of movements. The boy's chest, once still, rose ever so slightly. A breath, shallow, unsteady. But there, Elijah's eyes widened. He placed a hand over the child's heart, feeling the rhythmic thump of life returning. Then a gasp, sharp, desperate, and real. The boy's eyes fluttered open, his small hands grasping at the air as if reaching for something unseen. Elijah exhaled, his shoulders shaking in relief. God had answered. Gathering the boy into his arms once more, he descended the stairs, his pace quicker this time, his steps light with victory. The widow sat where he had left her, her face streaked with dried tears, her hands clasped as though she had long since run out of words to pray. When she heard the creak of the steps, she looked up, and there, standing before her, was Elijah, and in his arms, her son. She gasped, scrambling to her feet, hands trembling as she reached for the child. "He is alive," Elijah said simply, a small smile touching his lips. The widow let out a breathless sob, pressing her forehead against her son's, feeling the warmth of his skin, the rise and fall of his breathing. He clung to her, whispering her name. She looked up at Elijah, her eyes glistening. "Now I know," she said, her voice filled with awe, "that you are truly a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." In that moment, everything changed. Her faith, once hesitant and fragile, was now firm and unwavering. She had seen the impossible, felt it in her own hands, held it against her own heart. Where once there had been doubt, now there was certainty. Where once there had been death, now there was life. As we reach the end of this powerful story, let's take a moment to reflect on what it reveals about faith, trust, and the boundless mercy of God. The widow of Zarephath had already suffered much. She had watched her resources dwindle, felt the ache of hunger in both herself and her son, and had accepted that death was imminent. Then, when she chose faith, when she gave the last of what she had to the prophet Elijah, she witnessed a miracle. Her flour and oil did not run dry. God provided for her. But faith is rarely tested only once. When her son fell ill and died, Her heart wavered. Her pain resurfaced. She questioned Elijah, and perhaps in that moment, she questioned God as well. How often do we feel this way? We experience moments of divine provision, blessings, breakthroughs, moments when we see God's hand at work in our lives. But when trials come again, when the storms rise once more, our hearts tremble. Did we misunderstand? Did we misplace our trust? The widow's story reminds us that our faith journey is not defined by a single act of belief. It is a continuous walk, shaped by moments of struggle and surrender. God's provision does not always mean we will avoid hardship. Sometimes it means He will carry us through it. Elijah, a man of great faith, did not simply accept the boy's death. He took action. He prayed, he pleaded, and through his relentless trust in God's power, he witnessed the impossible, the restoration of life. How does this speak to us today? Perhaps there are things in our own lives that feel lost, dreams that have faded, relationships that seem broken beyond repair, hope that feels out of reach. But just as God restored the widow's son, He is a God of restoration in our lives as well. We may not always understand His timing, and we may not always see the outcome we desire, but we can trust that He is working even in the silence, even in the waiting. The widow's final words to Elijah are powerful. Now I know that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. This was not just about her son being brought back to life. This was about her own faith being brought to life. What is God calling you to trust Him with today? As you close your eyes and settle into the quiet of the night, let this story be a reminder. God sees you. He hears your prayers. And even in the moments of doubt, He is working all things for good. Thank you for joining me tonight for this beautiful story of faith and redemption. I hope it has brought you peace, encouragement, and a renewed sense of trust in God's presence in your life. As you rest tonight, let your heart be at ease. You are not alone in your struggles. Just as He provided for the widow, just as He answered Elijah's desperate plea, He is watching over you. Take a deep breath. Feel the comfort of knowing that the same God who performed miracles in ancient times is the same God who walks beside you today. Even when life feels uncertain, even when you don't have all the answers, He is there. He is faithful. So as you drift into sleep, release your worries into His hands. Trust that He is working behind the scenes, preparing blessings you cannot yet see. And when you wake with the morning light, may your heart be filled with renewed faith and peace. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe and join me again for another journey through the wonders of God's Word. Until next time, sleep well, rest in His love, and good night.